So I'd like to tell you about Pureland Buddhism, or as it's sometimes called, other power Buddhism. And so the first question, I guess, is why would we want to know about Pureland or other power Buddhism? And the immediate, simple answer to that is that it's one of the most widespread forms of Buddhism in the world. If you go to East Asia, it's quite the biggest, most popular form of Buddhism. In China, in Japan, in Vietnam, and yet in the West, in the literature, it's amazingly underrepresented. Even in the United States, one of the largest Buddhist organizations is Buddhist Churches of America, which is a Pureland Buddhist organization. But one does not see a great deal of representation of this in the literature, in the media. Pureland Buddhism, other power Buddhism, we need to get perhaps the essential idea. In what sense do we mean Pureland? In what sense do we mean an other power? Pureland is an English term in English, but is a translation of a Chinese and Japanese term that derives from the Sanskrit Buddha Kshetra. Kshetra means a field. So what we're talking about here is like the field of merit, or the field of influence of the Buddha, of a Buddha, of any Buddha, of the Buddhas of all times. So we're talking here about a power, an influence, a bit like a magnetic field, you might say. If you have a big magnet and you have bits of iron in the vicinity of that big magnet, then those small pieces of iron will get magnetized. The idea of other power is rather similar, that we, little bits of iron, get magnetized by a big bit of iron, which is a Buddha. It could be any Buddha. It could be the Buddha of history, Shakyamuni Buddha. It could be a Buddha of any time. The Mahayana sense of Buddha is of many Buddhas represented in the form of particular human beings at particular times in particular histories. But it's the spirit of what is Buddha, Buddha-ness, if you like, or Buddha nature, the spirit of Buddha nature. That's the crucial thing in Mahayana Buddhism. So, other power, Pureland Buddhism, is the idea that we are advanced spiritually, we are transformed through that power, not through our own power. And this is if you like, the vital distinction. It's not through our self-power, but through that other power. It's through being magnetized, if you like, in that way, that a transformation comes about. I said that Pureland Buddhism is very widespread in the Far East. If you go to Japan, of the 4 largest religious organizations, Buddhist organizations in the country, 3 of them are Pureland. The other one's Nichiren. The most popular, well-known form of Japanese Buddhism in the West is, of course, Zen. But Zen in Japan is much, much smaller than these large groups with many thousands of temples. In China too, Pureland is a very strong tendency within the established Buddhism of Chinese populations. In China itself, in Malaysia, in all the different parts of the Chinese diaspora. So Pureland is a big force in that part of Buddhism, but also when we look closely we see that in Tibetan Buddhism too. The basic approach of other power, Pure Land Buddhism, is a major part of all the schools of Tibetan Buddhism. One can think of Tibetan Buddhism as a kind of mixing of other power and self-power Buddhism. And even when we go to the avowedly self-power schools of Southern Asia, we go to Theravada countries, what you find is that although the forms of Theravada that have largely become popular in the West are derived from the rather more ascetic forest traditions of meditating monks dedicated to purifying their own minds through their own practice and their own power, the practice of ordinary people in Theravada countries is largely of an other power nature. The ordinary Buddhist in Thailand or in Burma goes to the temple to be in the presence of the Buddha. They offer their devotions, they make offerings, and they sit in the presence. And it's that presence that changes people's lives. It's not particularly the effort that they make themselves. It's the fact that they're willing to put themselves in that position. So, okay, Pure Land's very widespread, so that's one reason for wanting to know about it. But isn't Pure Land a kind of later development, a sort of superstition, a degenerate version? Isn't it rather the case that only the elite meditators really understand what this is about, and the common people accept a kind of second level or watered down form of Buddhism? Perhaps I'm putting this a bit strongly, but this is certainly the view that you see implicit in a lot of writing about Buddhism that you'll read in the West. Well, is this the case? Is Pure Land a later development, for instance? Well, I think not. If we actually look at the earliest records that we have of the Buddha, what do we see? We see that right at the heart of Buddhism, right from the beginning, the crucial thing is taking refuge. What does taking refuge mean? Well, to take refuge is to be a refugee. A refugee is somebody who admits that they themselves are in a rather powerless position, and they go to seek help, support, sustenance, nurture, protection from a greater power. That's the nature of taking refuge. And taking refuge is about the only practice that's common to all schools of Buddhism. Taking refuge is definitely an other power act. And when you look at the other power schools, the Pure Land Buddhist schools, and you ask what is their practice, as we will do in subsequent talks in this short series, what you find is that the practice, if you can call it practice, the central practice of all Pure Land schools is essentially taking refuge. In one way or another, the practice is always to take refuge, to call on the power of the Buddhas to influence your life in one way or another. So taking refuge, which is central to the whole of Buddhism, is another power act. And this was the first teaching that Buddha ever gave to anybody. When the Buddha, when we read about the Buddha's story, and we read how he attained his enlightenment, and then he went on his way to find the people that he'd been practicing with formerly. The first person he met was a wandering sadhu, and they had a short exchange in which the Buddha talked about how he had attained enlightenment and so on, and the sadhu was completely unconvinced and went his way. And we can imagine the sadhu smiling to himself at this young enthusiast that he'd just encountered. who we think of as the great sage. But then the next people that the Buddha met were two merchants, two lay people, and the fact that they were lay people is quite important in terms of the story that I'm telling here. These two merchants were convinced by the Buddha, were touched, impressed, moved by their encounter with him. And what did the Buddha teach them? The Buddha taught them to take refuge in the Buddha and to take refuge in the Dharma. And this was the first real teaching that Buddha ever gave. This was before the Buddha set out the Eightfold Path, before the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths. The first thing he taught was refuge. And I don't think anybody in any school of Buddhism would deny that refuge is a fundamental of Buddhism, always has been, right from the very beginning. Then if we look at the other end of the Buddha's life, when the Buddha was dying, he gave instructions, and he gave two different lots of instructions. He gave one lot of instructions to those who were renunciant monks, intent on their own salvation, on reaching nirvana. He gave one set of instructions to them. But he also gave another set of instructions to predominantly lay people who were there at his deathbed, who were full of grief at losing the great sage who had been such a support and comfort to them. They were distraught, and the Buddha said that when he died, they should cremate his body, and the relics should be taken and entombed in various stupas, or reliquaries, in different parts of the country. And these stupas would be places for the encouragement, for the renewal of faith of those who had faith in the Buddha. And it does appear from the archaeology that this is indeed what happened, that the relics were taken and stupas were set up. And when we look at these very early Buddhist sites, what we see is that the central feature would be the stupa, where lay people would come and make their devotions and be, as they felt, in the presence of the Buddha and in the presence of that sacred or holy influence that would have its effect on their life. And some distance away there would be a smaller enclosure for people who wanted to dedicate themselves to meditation and renunciation and to the search for nirvana. I think what we have to see here is that right from the beginning, the other power or Pureland approach to Buddhism was the popular approach. This was the approach of the great majority of people who thought of themselves as Buddhists. Ordinary people, lay people, people going about their business in the world. One hesitates, but what one has to say really is people like us, people like you and me. You know, if then it's very interesting that, like, Buddha prescribed both these routes. He prescribed a route for people who want to renounce this world and have the kind of great self-determination to pursue the route directly to enlightenment by their own efforts. He prescribed a route of that kind. But for most of us, it's way out of reach. And for most of us, and for most Buddhists throughout most of history, an other power, or Pureland approach, has been what they have followed. So it is really very strange that if you go into a bookshop in Europe, in North America, you find the Buddhist section, you'll find several shelves of books on Buddhism and hardly anything about Pureland, which has been the major form of Buddhism throughout history and has a very strong claim to have been there as the most popular right from the very beginning.